All right. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Hope you're all doing well. We're really excited for this presentation. I can see people are filtering in, so I'm just gonna discuss what we're talking about today as people are filtering in. Um, so this webinar is going to revolve around a survey we conducted where we asked participants their expected costs for various marketing projects in 2024. But as far as the structure for today, we have Nick and Dustin are going to warm us up talking about trends to expect for 2024. They have some really, really good insights. Then I'm going to share some high-level findings from our survey. Then we're going to go project by project type into the findings from our survey. And lastly, we're going to give guidance on what we see as actual costs in the marketplace. And with that, I guess I'll give a little bit of an introduction. So I'm Peter. I'm the CEO here at Adenea Bailey, and I'm happy to be presenting the surveys from the findings from our survey. And thanks for everyone who filled it out. We had a lot of great participation. I'm joined by Dustin, our accounts director, and he's going to give his insights onto the actual costs of marketing projects. And Dustin, I think we're pretty lucky to have you here to do that. Dustin, he is our accounts director. He's also the president of MADE, so I can't think of anyone in Maine more tapped into what the actual costs of marketing projects are. So I'm excited to hear from you, Dustin. Also joined by our creative director, Nick. Nick's going to start us off with trends, and he's going to kind of color in the lines between Dustin and my commentary. And he's uniquely suited to do this as well because he's an award-winning creative director across multiple disciplines. So yeah, we got a lot to cover today. Before we dig in, we do have a couple ground rules. We love when people have cameras on. If you don't feel comfortable doing that is okay. We also ask if you have any questions or insights, throw them into chat. And if you want to come on with an insight or question, use Zoom's raise your hand feature, and we'll bring you in at a natural point. We do ask that you try to be succinct because we actually have a lot to cover today. And with that, Nick, just to kind of get us warmed up here, why don't you tell us a little bit about trends coming up here for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I know that I know that the lion's share of the discussion we're going to have today is going over the survey and kind of results. But I think it's helpful to kind of contextualize all the conversation that we have around the survey and how we're thinking about marketing in 2024 through a couple of different lenses that we're seeing, both kind of those that we predicted and those that are, I mean, we're now 2 months into the year, starting to see really kind of follow through. And the first one is that 2024 is really turning into the year of repositioning in a lot of ways. We're 4 years out from the pandemic, but it still kind of reverberates. So, as much as I hate bringing up the pandemic, the fact of the matter is that the 2020 did two things. It disrupted the direction of a lot of companies for costs, consumers, etc., but it also reset and changed consumer behaviors and expectations. 2020 was a big year to reevaluate how we lived our lives, how we spent our money, and where we were positioned in our industries. And 2021 through 2023 was really picking up the pieces. That was when a lot of organizations, nonprofits, 501c3s, as well as companies started to discover kind of what the new status quo was, whether that's costs, whether that's consumers, opportunities, even talent acquisition, which was a huge pain point for folks for a while. As we kind of discovered where we were all positioned within our industries or how those industries have changed, I think 2023 was a time when a lot of us were ready to move forward. We kind of understood the lessons, or had pulled at least some lessons from the pandemic. We kind of had a sense of the lay of the land, but everybody was talking about a recession, and there was a lot of recession anxiety. And so we actually saw a reduction in spending in 2023 that was one of the largest reductions in marketing and creative spending that we've seen in the last 10 years, including the pandemic, which is really fascinating. But now that 2024 is rolling around, we've kind of have those recession anxieties put to bed. We have a sense of where we are and how we're positioned. And so we're seeing a lot of companies spending, many for the first time since even 2020. and they're using those dollars to reposition themselves, their products, or their brands reflective of the world that basically fundamentally changed in 2020. They understood in 2022. They were afraid to invest in 2023, and now here in 2024, we're seeing a huge year for rebranding and repositioning across all scales of companies. That's reflected, I think, a little bit in how we're seeing budgets being spent differently, both small and large, right, Dustin?
Right, Nick. It's you know, one of the things that we found fascinating looking at the ups and downs of 2023, especially all the way going back to 2020. But as we've kind of used this as kind of like a benchmark for last year, getting data rather early in or rather late in 2022, you know, we kind of took another approach in gaining more information around this, and it's been fascinating to see. And you'll see some of the data that we have kind of speak a little bit to, you know, budgets getting bigger and smaller. So people who are spending you know, money this year, you know, under 50,000 and trying to keep it rather tight, are seeing, you know, are looking at the market and decreasing, while competitors that are larger are spending more. They're seeing the opportunities. They're seeing them and themselves in the marketplace as a spot to be able to get ahead of everybody. You know, we've survived through a recession, and now it's time to invest, and time to broadcast, and time to get back out into the market, because the part of those spending habits that have kind of changed are still demanding high quality goods and still demanding a lot from the marketplace. So, you know, it's funny to see how some of the smaller businesses, smaller budgets getting smaller, and trying to find their ways to really restrict themselves, whereas, you know, you're seeing larger businesses, larger organizations spend a lot more in these areas than we have seen in years previously. So it's just fascinating to see where the mindset is. And as we kind of go through the data here and look at the you know, look at some of the different costs for some of these different projects, just think, you know, kind of in terms of whether you are what position you're in your company, or or if you're in a fellow agency, or if you're, you know, attached in some way as a marketing professional. You know, is your, you know, is your strategy and is your leadership really budget stricken, or are they looking to free up? And you know, what part of the scale are you actually on? Because you can kind of see that between you and your competitors very clearly right now, as people are envisioning their 2024 strategy and starting to enact it here 2 months in. But you know, 2024 is going to be one of those kind of years, because it's also a very political year, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah. I don't know if anybody's heard, but 2024 is going to be a big year for politics. That's impacting a lot of marketing decisions, I think. Ad buys are always more expensive in election years. That's really, really true, I think, this year. Ad buys get higher everywhere. They're not just going to get higher in swing states. I think when we're talking about Maine, there's been an increased emphasis on local governance and investments in local elections, particularly from national PACs, national advocacy organizations. They're making even small races big deals. You're seeing almost smaller PAC investments in national elections and larger PAC investments in local ones. That means two things are happening. One, anytime that you're trying to make big investments in marketing, it's going to cost you a lot more, starting probably around June, and really spiking as we get into November. The second thing it means is that you're going to have a lot of other voices drowning out your marketing messaging, unless you are highly targeted, and you're making very, very specific kinds of spend with a very specific goal. It's part of the reason why I think we're seeing 2024 as a big year for rebrands, repositioning websites, et cetera, is because marketing campaigns themselves are going to have a lot of competition on the national platform. The other thing too is that because of the nature of, you know, I know that culture war is a loaded term, but because of the nature of kind of the politicization of everything, 2024 means that there's a much larger chance that industries that don't think of themselves as politicized or are political are more likely to get drawn into an unexpected culture war or drawn in and become politicized. Electric versus gas stoves is a good example. Kind of came out of nowhere Suddenly it became ground zero for big political discussions and arguments. Other organizations that already deal with specific advocacy or nonprofit work are all the more likely to find themselves getting drawn into things, even those that try to be nonpartisan as opposed to bipartisan. Sometimes society just won't let you be nonpartisan. They won't let you take a side in an election year like this. That means that we're also seeing a lot of organizations coming up with crisis communication plans or putting some money aside in case they need to suddenly make a big spend. And that's really just acknowledging that that marketing is going to cost more and that it's a lot less predictable who you're going to be talking to in the middle of the year. So anyway, those are kind of big three trends to set stuff up. And I want to throw it back to you, Peter, because I know you're eager to get into the survey.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. And just two things on the political factor. I'll send a replay, and our Culture Wars webinar will be in the replay playlist. I recommend that. We did a whole webinar on navigating the Culture Wars. And also we have Susan Townsend from Spectrum Cable on right now, and I know that she can definitely agree with your thoughts on the political factor for the election coming up and how that's going to affect marketing strategy in 2024. But that was a great way to kick us off. And a big part of what we're talking about today is our survey. And the results, they're definitely interesting, and we kind of are using it for an icebreaker for a conversation on what are the actual costs of marketing projects in 2024. Our survey, we had over 40 submissions for the survey, and it was sent out to our network of agency owners, marketing directors, and executives at nonprofits and for-profits. The results come from individuals in higher ed, insurance companies, small business owners, small, large nonprofits, consumer packaged goods, retail. So there was a pretty good spectrum, I think, that represents our market here. We asked 5 questions. The first were more high level. What is your marketing budget? Have you seen an increase or a decrease versus 2023? And then more project specific questions we asked are, if you were to rebrand, what would you expect the cost? If you were to redesign your website, what would you expect the cost to be? And finally, how much would you expect a video to cost? So I have the 2 graphs from the higher level questions here. And the first one is what is your marketing budget? And so we had about 50% of participants had a budget of under $50,000. 14% had a budget between $50,000 and $150,000, and then 20% $150,000 to $300,000, and then 20% over $300,000. I wasn't necessarily surprised by this, Nick or Dustin. I don't know if you were. I guess the one little slice I was surprised about was that $50,000 to $150,000 mark. I expected that to be a little bit higher, but this sort of just gives an example of our individuals who took the survey, what their marketing budgets are. Now, I think the burning question for Nick, Dustin, and I that we were interested in, just from what we're seeing as an agency, was this question of has your marketing budget increased or decreased since 2023? And so 57% of participants said their budget had increased, and 43% said their budget had decreased. And this made complete sense to me, because this is what we're feeling. Dustin, you agree? This is kind of what you're feeling. And Nick, when I saw this too, and I heard what you were just saying, this feels like some of this push is repositioning. This is an investment in repositioning, and I know we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that is a lot of what that increases, is people are seeing now is the time to make the investment after all we've been through the past couple years.
Yeah, I mean, Dustin can speak more to this kind of all across the board, being a business development guy more than I am, for sure. I think that, but something else that comes up a lot when we're looking at consumer patterns over the last couple of years is investing in quality. You know what I mean? Like, cry now. as opposed to cry later sort of attitude. And that's been the case across all kinds of different products, services. People are more likely to invest in something that takes $500 to pay once rather than subscription services, that kind of thing. I think that this is reflective of that a little bit here. I think that you're seeing people making investments in their brand rather than making investments in kind of broad marketing or like short-term purchases. So something that we've been seeing a lot is people prepared to make big investments in their websites, for instance. And I think that that's kind of reflective of this, which is, and I think wise, given the way that marketing is probably going to go this year, is making those big investments in rebrands and websites. So
Yeah. And I think part of that recession anxiety, as you talked about, is starting to loosen its grip, because I do feel like when we started this last year, we saw a lot of brands reduce their spending early on and then break their budgets later on in the year. So more and more we see people, taking a little bit extra to see that their marketing budget doesn't get out of hand as they look at 2024, especially knowing all the different kind of things that are happening in it. So it tends to grow where we think it's going to grow. I'm actually surprised it's not more increased. I think from the experiences that I've seen for like looking at 2024 in the future.
So we'll jump into the project specific survey results. We played with various graphs, but the three of us just decided that this bar graph was just the simplest illustration of the data. So on the x-axis here, we just have the various participants, and then on the y-axis, we have their expected cost if they were to undergo a rebrand. And the results for rebrand were on the lower end, anywhere from 5,000 to the higher end up to 250,000. So we do certainly have a big spectrum there. I wanted to include the median and average. I'm still on the fence with giving guidance. And Dustin, I think what you're about to talk about, it's just, to me, looking at this graph, it just how it lines up with the median and the average. Is very insightful. But one thing I'll mention, Dustin, what you were just talking about is smaller budgets getting smaller, bigger budgets getting bigger. I kind of see that in this graph here. So I also found that extremely insightful. But yeah, so this is what the expected costs for a rebrand were. And Dustin, you want to take us through what you think are the actual costs out there in the marketplace?
Yes. So, taking some time, having conversations as the president of Maynad Design, I had the opportunity to sort of bat this around a little bit with people who are freelancers, who are providing services, other small agency owners, and of course, some of the larger agencies in Maine, and trying to check out what's outside of market as well. So getting an understanding of kind of like what the realistic cost is, I think was important, as we kind of see where our surveys have brought up people's expectations and what they kind of look like in our local market, essentially. So when looking at rebrands, I think it's important as we're thinking about like what is rebranding, and I think each one of these has a little bit of its own limitations. So rebranding, of course, is not just a visual identity. It can be a lot of different things included into a rebrand process. So everything from the positioning that we're talking about as like official documents, to a full brand strategy, to the actual costs of being able to roll out a rebrand. So depending on the scale of the rebrand you're having and the amount of assets you have as a company, it can kind of vary, and you should understand the kind of partnership you should have for those. But really looking over it, when we're seeing like rebrands as an item that is not just a logo mark, but a logo mark with its materials and sort of rollout pieces. We're seeing in like the freelance market that, that it is that 7,500 to 15,000. Like it's relatively small. It's quick. It's generally by one or two people. It's within, a lot of, I think, that median budget that you kind of see out there, but it's also not, the expectation is really you're working with a designer. You're not working with an agency. You're not working towards a much grander strategy. You're working on really a component of it and not a full rebrand, generally, when you're looking at those costs. Small and large agencies, when you're thinking about the full rollout, when you're thinking about all the different nooks and crannies, details, in which Nick can go into great detail as being our creative director, but thinking about this from these different angles. Small agencies being nimble, having a dedicated team sort of around it, you're seeing of course that little bit of overhead, and expecting it to be around 12 to 50,000, knowing that it can take X amount of time to really bring a brand through. Some of the experiences we've had last year have kind of brought about thinking a lot more than just sitting down and doing digital design, but also sort of doing a bit of brand therapy, understanding brand consultation along the way, and building that consensus. So you can kind of see that working with smaller agencies is going to be kind of within that medium to that average. That 12,000 to 50,000 is kind of the expected cost you're going to see when sitting down and sending out a proposal, sending out a request for proposal, or sitting down and having a conversation with an agency. And then, of course, larger agencies, you're expecting to have a lot more overhead, have a lot more working with sort of the data aspect of it, and expecting those different services to expend cost. And you really see those really climb up 40,000 to 100,000 depending on the scale of your rebrand and the size of your organization.
So something that I wanted to jump in here, and you're going to see me do this for kind of all of these, our rebrands, our websites, and our video pieces. Kind of sidestep the question around perceived cost and actual cost, and talk a little bit about how you can really maximize value. Because I think that's really what is a larger discussion that's happening here, particularly when organizations are expecting that something's going to cost X and they realize that it actually costs Y, is really trying to figure out a way that you can walk away feeling like you've made a good decision or a good investment. So when we talk about rebrands, I think it's important to remember that these aren't just it's not just a facelift for your logo. It's an opportunity for really broad realignment. That means getting your team on board with the vision you have for the company. It means finding ways to make a full company tilt, full company change where you need to. The first thing that I think, and all of this is kind of predicated upon working with an external agency or some sort of external partner to kind of help you think this through. I swear to God, it's not as self-serving as it sounds when an agency tells you should work with an agency. But rebrands are big. They're hard to do. They're also really hard to do for yourself. One of the values of kind of doing a rebrand is being able to use it to build buy-in. If you're thinking about repositioning your brand, and thinking about a change in direction, it's really helpful to have internal meetings, shared brainstorms, surveys, things that an agency can offer, an HR team can offer, senior leadership can sometimes offer, depending on your structure. But the idea is to help build buy-in and really get your team behind wherever you're headed. Sometimes it's what should our logo look like, fellas? More often than not, though, it's what are our key values? It's what do we sound like? What's our voice? How are we represented? Does this resonate with you? You really need to take your team along whenever you're making any major decision and pivot. So when I talk about a rebrand here, it might just be that we're rebranding how we talk about the services we provide, or how we talk about the products we create. It doesn't mean that you need a new logo or a new website, but it does mean that you're changing and repositioning. And if you do that and you leave your employees behind, that's going to be problematic. So a rebrand used to build in buy-in is a really wonderful investment, if for no other reason than preventing turnover. A second thing that's really helpful is to use it as a catch-up broadly. Your visual brand is rarely the only thing that you need to update. Frequently, when we get people who are looking for a visual update, we find that they need to consider a new marketing strategy, or they need to reevaluate who their competitors are. They need to check how they're spending resources. If you're going to engage in a rebrand, you should be doing all of those things. That discovery should happen at the front end. If you're paying an agency to help you do that, they should be doing that. That's part of that cost up front. And you're going to get a lot of value back by having a discovery period that really takes a look at current spending and current positioning in the market. Another way that I think you can really make some bang for buck here is using a rebrand to find your voice. Rarely companies sound the way they do intentionally. Almost always, particularly with the kinds of clients that we find here in Maine, it's a reflective of who the president or founder of an organization is, or it's reflective of, well, we've always talked about our services this way, or sometimes it's outdated. You know, we've worked with mental health organizations that don't want to use the word mental health because of the stigma it had 15, 20 years ago, right? That's changed. They can talk about themselves differently than they currently do. So finding your voice and then using a rebrand as an opportunity to communicate that and train your staff is really, really, really helpful. It's also helpful to understand how your customers or your potential members want to be talked to and make sure that you're having the right conversations with the right tones. So this isn't just about everybody likes red, white, and blue now. Let's make our logo those colors. It's people expect that they're going to be communicated to in a certain way or on certain platforms. And that's the last thing that I would say is a real value here is if you want to do a rebrand and it looks like it costs a lot of money, you should be thinking about it in terms of how you're unifying your platforms, your brand across multiple spaces. You know, your company probably looks different in different places, and I'm sure that that's not intentional. Somebody set up your Facebook page forever ago. Nobody's updated the Instagram. Somebody convinced someone to set up a TikTok account and nobody's ever posted on it. Like these are like kind of comical examples that we find a lot, but then there's a lot of other places where nobody's done a rebrand on the brochure, which doesn't match the website, which doesn't match the logo. And all these things sound and look and feel a little different. It's confusing to people that you're trying to reach out to. It's disorienting when you're trying to get people to invest or people to apply. You're trying to use it to bring in new talent. And also, frankly, it's a little bit backbreaking. It suggests that you're an organization that doesn't pay attention to the details, and everybody wants somebody paying attention to the details. So really using a rebrand to unify your platforms here is awesome. And it's also a great time to decide you should probably cancel that Instagram account that nobody's updated, you know? So anyway, broadly speaking, there's a lot of ways to get a lot of value from a rebrand, regardless whether you think it should be 100,000 or 50,000 or 12. I'm going to get off my soapbox though and pass it back to you, Peter. I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about website stuff, right?
No, that was great, Nick. Yeah. So again, just to go back to our chart, but here with websites over rebrand, the spectrum of results was from 5,000 to 200,000. I know Dustin's going to have some to say on the differences here within that spectrum. The average was right around 36,600. The median was 20,000. I mean, I just love this graph because you can really visualize all the results here. Just one note I had is this looks very similar to the rebrand data set. And I think we're going to see, you know, in video, we're going to see some a data set that looks a little bit different here. But Nick or Dustin, did you have any thoughts when you saw this while kind of people soak in this graph a little bit?
It's more realistic. But also I think like the groupings are a little bit more common for, I think people have a certain people have a much better grasp on what they feel a full website actually is versus a rebrand. I think a rebrand can be in a very amorphous thing, as Nick kind of beautifully went through it. So like a website, you know, has a certain, you know, beginning, middle, end that people can kind of have a better understanding around. So, and their expectation also feels, especially like looking at some of the results that I think we saw last year, is that it has gone up and it has been higher of an expectation of like web costs this much because of all of the different things that have changed in web, even though in the last couple of years.
And just one more thing I'd mention is you can really see that median, you know, how many results were at that $20,000 mark, which I found really interesting. And Dustin, like going back to I can sort of picture your actual costs. You can really see the sort of split on this graph, but why don't you take us through the actual costs?
Yeah, because I think when sitting down and talking with different people in the industry and getting a better understanding of like what has kind of shaped up over the last year and what people are looking to spend and understanding the scope of their website, I think has kind of really been better to flesh out. When we're looking at like, you know, we'll call it a rather simple solution, you know, going with a freelancer, usually a lone developer, who has a skill set of trying to sort of build an entire website, but usually has more of just a language background to be able to build one. We're seeing that 5,000 to 12,000, which is still pretty common for those who are kind of looking to try to update a website, but not really have a full like 10-year investment in front of them. That's where it generally kind of like ends up being is having that kind of partnership, contracting out very individually over that kind of product. I've seen a couple of different scenarios around that over last year myself. So we've seen that in the marketplace, but most people are seeing, the advantages of working with a full agency on, being able to do that kind of like due diligence around branding, having a certain quality of product. And you really see that between that $10,000 and $40,000 range in the small agency kind of realm. We've seen it a lot, from last year's results and this year's results, is that's kind of that kind of happy medium of having a dedicated team that has the aspects to work on a website. So knowing that you have a dedicated team that has a copywriter, has a designer, has a developer, has a creative director, has somebody who has an understanding of SEO and everything like that, you see the expected cost around that to have the appropriate overhead and to produce the superior product. And of course, when we kind of look at, large agency, we're looking at, full web development teams kind of developed on a much larger scale. We see that a lot more common in larger e-com websites and in more specialized areas outside of the usual nonprofit kind of area. But there are those kind of projects that sort of line up and end up being something that requires a large agency to sort of tackle, and it does come with the large agency tag.
Dustin,
Something-
just real quick, Nick, Sue was saying 30,000 looks a little low for a large agency.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to jump in. I think there's two things that I'd point out. I think the first one is I think 30,000 does feel a little small for large agency work. I think that might be reflected of 2023 was a hard time for a lot of agencies. We saw a lot of agencies fold, a lot of agencies lay off a bunch of folks. And I think that ultimately you ended up seeing cuts in cost, like cuts in what they were charging for some of these things near the end of 2023 in an effort to really just like survive the year and see what 24 had to offer. So that might be indicative of it being 30 when it probably should be somewhere closer to 60, 55, somewhere around there. The other thing I want to flag is the freelancer thing. God, it just feels like there's a couple of like famous blunders. You know what I mean? Never start a land war in Asia. Never hire a freelancer to build your whole company website. And the reason why I say that is because you don't know enough about your website to know when they are messing up a website. You know what I mean? You just know so little about it. And freelancers, it's one of those things where like don't take 100-year warranty from somebody who's only been around in business for 5 years. Like that 100-year warranty means very little. I think when you look at freelancers, are they going to be able to offer support and regular updates on your website throughout the use of that website? Probably not. Most freelancers don't end up freelancing for more than 12 or 16 months. Rarely are they building something within a WordPress system that will survive multiple updates, changes, revisions, etc. A lot of them rely on third-party plugins that don't age well. I mean, it ages like milk, frankly. So this is not me saying this as somebody who works in an agency, but more me saying this as somebody who's watched or picked up the pieces for other companies who tried the freelancer work. But with some exceptions, and I've worked with some really great freelancers in the web space, it's a really kind of dangerous proposition. I think it's really touch and go when you talk about freelancers for web. And I want to make sure that it's clear. I'm only really talking about web. There's some wonderful freelance videographers, graphic designers. There's a lot of spaces where I think you can play in those spaces. This one is, I think there's a lot of hidden costs if you go freelancer and it doesn't work out well. Having said that, there's a lot of ways that you can really maximize websites. And I think, Dustin said something along the lines of, or maybe Peter, that there's a little bit more clarity around what a website is, that, compared to rebrands, that's kind of big and amorphous. We understand what a website is. I would say that's true, but I would say that a lot of people don't understand what a website can be. We've had clients where we sit down and we go, okay, like, let's talk about your website. And they go, we just need a storefront. It's the equivalent of a business card. We just need to legitimize that we exist because we have a website. And what I would say is you're leaving a lot of value on the table. The first of which is, and probably the most important, is when you're building a website, your website should shape the behavior of your visitors. That website should act as some sort of funnel. You don't have to be selling a product for it to be a funnel. You can be an advocacy organization and you're trying to get people to take an action or learn about a specific aspect of what you're telling them. You can be providing a service free of charge and you're just trying to get people to sign up or register for that. But websites almost always have a purpose. If you exist and you offer any kind of service or do any work of any kind, your website, the website itself and each individual page should have a reason to exist. We should talk about what that is, and you should work to try to make sure that it does that job well. I feel like that's a strategic conversation that people don't realize. And then there's a little bit of a light bulb moment that we see when people start thinking in those terms. A great way to maximize the value here is also to think of it as a tool and build your site as a tool. What do you need your site to do that will make your team's job easier? How do you use it to streamline tasks? How do you minimize administrative work? In one case, we were doing a website for a restaurant, and that restaurant had to update all of their menu every week online, and then they needed to go to a separate Word document and type it up and then send it to a printer to have it printed out. It was crazy. And they're updating it all the time, but they really liked the aesthetic of the website and they really liked the aesthetic of the menu printed, and they were different. We were able to build something that looks like A on the website, but prints out totally different as B when you print it, and you can opt to print it with bleeds and send it to a printer if you want to do a high quality C. And all of that is updated simply on WordPress with one addition. That's it. We were able to take out, on average, they said 12 hours a week of staff time just by building that specific tool in, and we were able to reduce the printer cost for them. All because we thought about it as a tool. How can you make that a tool? There are countless examples here where you bring it up. I don't want to bog us down, but if you start thinking about a website as a tool, not only does it maximize the value of the site, but all of a sudden you're lowering costs, time, opportunity, etc., from the rest of staff. So think about it in those terms. And the last one I would say is the website should serve you as a partner. You can build a website so it becomes a resource. If you've got people out on the road who are selling something, that website is a brochure. Maybe there's a portal. Maybe there's a back-end element there that ends up making it something that serves in an almost partnership role with what you're trying to achieve. All of a sudden, it doesn't become, oh no, we need to update our website, or God, I think it's there. Just let me just type it in 1 second. Like, build a website, make it mobile first, give yourself a portal for current users, current members of a service you provide, business people that are on the road, etc. And all of a sudden, you're helping to align and keep everybody on the same message with the same talking points and the same value propositions, like we talked about with rebrands, and your website is a tool that does that. So these are all ways that you can make this a better investment than it might seem on first blanch if you think about websites strategically, as opposed to the way we think about business cards or letterhead. So I'm going to get off what is very much a soapbox on that one and move on to video.
Just real quick, back to Sue's insight there. I got to back up Dustin here and say, I think this is exactly the range you're going to see here in Maine. Higher if it's obviously a much more complicated e-commerce site. I think in Boston, as Nick said, you're going to see $60,000 starting mark, or a bigger city, but maybe not the biggest here in Maine isn't going to start at 30, but some of the larger agencies, for a simple website, we're going to be right at the $30,000 mark. So Dustin, I think you got,
and that's part of it too. Some of the simpler ones, smaller content, Shopify built first kind of materials too. Those all kind of end up being around that size, as less of a larger WordPress or Magenta kind of styled site that you would expect to see at that kind of cost.
No, that was great. Moving on to video, we have a graph here that looks a little bit different. The range for video was anywhere from $3,500 on the low end, all the way up to $125,000 on the higher end. The average was 16,200 and the median was 10,000. Dustin, I think you're going to have a lot to say, and Nick, I think you're going to have a lot to say on this one. This data set was the most surprising to me. If you have anything quick while people are kind of absorbing this graph to say, jump in, but otherwise we can go into the what you see as the actual cost.
I mean, quickly, I would just say that I could make you a video for 10 grand. I don't know that you're gonna like it a lot. It depends really on your audience and your customer expectations, what you're gonna use it for. I've directed commercials for $600,000 that ran for 30 seconds, at some point the question is like, are you trying to make something that's scrappy? Are you trying to make something that feels scrappy? And kind of how can you align creative to match your budget and match your audience? Um, Median feels very low to me on this. And I think it's because everybody's close enough to video that they think they know what video should be. I think that like we're around video content a lot. People are making video with their phones all the time. There's kind of an assumption that it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like the less you know about something, the more confident you are in your opinion. And I think everybody it feels like they understand what it takes to make high quality video. And I mean, video is closer to web, frankly, when you talk about investment than it is to this. In the kind of the way that you talk about cost, it involves a hell of a lot more people, and it's as highly technical, if not more. That would be my initial knee jerk. But I'm gonna throw it to Dustin because Dustin's the one who actually tries to sell people on buying video. So I know that you talk about this
Well,
differently.
I think the grouping of the data right there, though, when you kind of see it, is that if similar to trends that we saw last year, is that there is still a consistent, rather low valuation of video in our marketplace in particular. And I think that that's something that I think we touched upon a bit last year. And I know, Nick, you've got notes on it too for this year, but it is something that I think when you really take a look at it, people don't have what's appropriately thinking for professional video. And I think, when we talk about actual costs, I can kind of define a little bit why I think that is. Because I think, as an agency and as somebody who's worked in this industry has lots of different freelance video people in mind when I think of some of these items and having those conversations, is that the scope of video is usually the big challenge that people seem to get to. Because for some people, they essentially think, social media has a kind of devalued video in a way that people think that they know better. And you have the kind of, what's a good way to put it? Kind of like the elaborate kind of B-roll, right? Social media B-roll, where you find like a lot of freelance work. I think that when we talk about like the scope of a video, it definitely changes where you're going to be finding your partnership in that, whether it's going to be a very small video project, or whether it is going to be something large scale. So I think there's always a little bit of that amorphous piece to video, but really when having conversations with people about like what they've been charging, what they've been seeing in the marketplace, these are the kind of like totals that don't quite full like one over the other follow up, but like it's something that we've noticed. I think particularly of last year, seeing the recession anxiety, we saw a lot of jumping to getting as much video content as cheap as possible. And we see a lot of freelancers even devaluing some of their own stuff and bringing it down to an area that's like 35 to 5. There was some a little bit higher than that, but they became more of like making multiple videos and multiple deliverables. So we kind of like brought it down to what this kind of looks like for like doing a video project that seems to be within scope of some of the other things we've been discussing. But sitting down and seeing that compared to how small agencies or video only agencies have kind of been working them out throughout the last 2 years, this year and last year, and seeing that sort of 8,000 to 30,000, depending on the scope of the video, depending on the amount of working pieces, the amount of actual professional staff on an actual shoot, really being building up that overhead, you can kind of see. And then of course, large agency doing the usual for their large scale kind of video work in our local market, starting a little bit lower than I think some people would expect. And of course, topping out a lot higher than depending on, what kind of project that we would expect. But that's how this kind of all came together on this one.
Yeah, I mean, some things to consider here. I think that doing video with freelancers, I think that should be plural, because in no case are you hiring one person to make a video, or I think should you? There's definitely you know, people here or there who'll shoot and edit something for you, but if you're a company or an organization that's taking the time to be on a call like this, you're probably taking this a little bit more seriously and have enough skin in the game that you're going to need a director of photography, and you're going to need to direct, and you probably want to bring in somebody who's going to make sure everybody's lit well. Bonus points if you can bring in some sound, you know. It's rarely is this a one person job. And that doesn't even get to the cost of bringing in the right kind of equipment and making sure that you're shooting something that's going to be evergreen and valuable. I would say that when we look at the agency, the high end of 100,000, I mean, it could go infinitely higher than that. I think it's really more indicative of what kind of video content people tend to be making in the market here. I would also say that some of these video costs are actually higher here in Maine than they would be if you were hiring somebody in a New York, or, you know, certainly in LA, where those are two industry cities where costs are lower because it's more highly competitive. And I would say that when you're operating even in Boston, you know, anywhere in New England, the costs are a little higher per person because there are fewer people who do this stuff and do it really well. Having said all that, talking about how expensive this stuff can be, is video is really a valuable commodity. It performs 612%. If we're curious about specifics, it on average performs 612% better than photos or graphics when you talk about organic or paid marketing. And that's across the board. We like our pictures. We like our pictures even better when they move. And that's about 6 times more effective than anything else you're going to do. So let's talk about how you can make it worth it, how you can convince somebody or convince yourself to spend the money on it. The first thing I would say is pre-produce it. Pre-production is critical. You guys doing anything, you should probably do a lot of pre-production and thinking before you do any kind of projects, independent of creative. But really understanding what you want to use your video for, how you can create multiple cuts. Typically, there's the classic 30, 15, 6-second cuts that people will do for social or online. But think about how you can cut it, how you can cut it shorter, what platforms you can use it on, whether there's a big event you can debut it at. How are you going to get to your audience, and how can you use iterations of the video you're shooting to get to your audience is really important. Pre-producing it also means you're going to save a lot of costs. You're not going to have to go through 5 or 6 edits. You can do it in 2 or 3. Because you know exactly what you're going for and what you want. Also, by pre-producing, you start to understand what you're trying to communicate, and then you can come up with some creative solutions that work within your production boundaries. We did a shoot for another restaurant, actually, as an example. They had a very small budget, so what we did is we did 4 commercials, and all the commercials were shot with the same overhead lockup, so that they all felt like they were consistent and on brand with the same style. And we brought in different voice actors and put down different surfaces, so it felt like each one of these was shot in a kitchen, in a living room, in a restaurant, etc. But really what we're able to do, we're just do 4 30-second commercials in a day. This is probably the lowest budget piece I've worked on to get something like that out. But the point that I want to articulate here is it was a clear creative vision that was shared across multiple platforms and felt uniform and consistent with the brand for a year. And that was something we were able to do because we pre-produced the hell out of it. The second thing I would say is shoot big, shoot really big video. Most content that you see is being consumed in 2K. For reference, when you watch the Super Bowl, it was broadcast in glorious 4K. When you go to movies in cinema, you're going to see 4K stuff. That said, everything that you're doing is being viewed mostly in 2K. Most everything that you're seeing shot should be shot in 4K, yeah, even at a freelancer level. You can shoot that stuff in 6K. All that stuff means is that you're getting more data, which means you can zoom in or reframe however you want. So you're basically getting an image this big when really you only need an image that big. What that means is you can reframe stuff as long as you want. You can reuse it in a lot of different ways. It means, I think most importantly, that your content will be outdated before your video looks outdated. So anything that you're capturing in this space at a really high resolution is going to be stuff that you can reuse as fodder for a website or as B-roll down the road. You start to build out your own video library, which you can only do if you also own your video. Make sure that anybody you shoot with, you own the content that you get. I think this is becoming increasingly industry standard. Sometimes you'll find large agencies who fight back a little bit, but advocate for being able to own your footage. If it's co-ownership, the agency also owns that footage, but you do as well. That's fine. The point is that if you own that footage, you can come up with a lot of other uses down the road if you haven't pre-produced for it, or if there's opportunities that pop up. You don't need a video editor in-house to do that stuff either. There's lots of easy editing apps, stuff that you can train up for to do easy social. There's a lot of different ways to use that if you own that footage. I think really what it comes down to here is that you shouldn't only get one video out of one video production day. There's a lot of work that goes into that video. And so if you're going to shoot, think about all the different ways that you can utilize that afterwards and how that can become part of your library. The last thing is I would say you can also incorporate photography as part of that equation. I don't mean it in the sense of, well, let's just pause right here and take a still. That almost never works. We frame photos differently than we frame video. Video has motion blur, even at the highest resolutions. Don't plan to do that. But if you're going to be setting up a studio, if you're going to have everybody looking good, if you're going to make sure that your CEO irons their shirt and puts on some makeup and gets rid of the shiny bald, look on their head, like, well, if you've done all that, bring in a photographer too. You know what I mean? Get some stills, get some behind the scenes, get some of that stuff. It's going to help with internal cohesion. People are going to like seeing how that stuff was shot. It's fun to share that stuff on social. And then it's also just great to be able to get some extra stills along the way. So again, piggyback on any of that big production and really see where you can make it last longer and get more out of the day. But video is very much worth it. That's stand.
That was great. So that kind of concludes going project by project and showing the survey results and the actual cost. We are going to be compiling this into a report that we'll be sending out to everyone, and I'll definitely be sending this replay to everyone. But if like now's the time, if anyone has any questions, throw it into chat. And Dustin, Nick, if you guys have any key takeaways while people are throwing their questions or insights in, feel free to fire away.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, kind of jumping off of our trends, looking at how things have cost over the last year. One of the things that we kind of threw back and forth as we were talking about this, talking about this subject is, it's a good year to be strategic in your budget spending and thinking about your long-term success. A lot of the projects that we're showing right now, right, are not, just a single marketing campaign, because we're looking at things that are going to exist beyond 2024. And we're seeing that same kind of like buyer persona exist even as a business owner, where they're not looking for multiple cheap things. They are looking for one good quality thing that they're going to spend their budget on and kind of call it quits. So knowing that, like, the brand work that's done this year, the website that's done this year, the video that is being done this year, really is something as an asset to be used for multiple years. It's an investment in a lot less of a purchase. And I think that's one key takeaway, that anybody looking at their marketing budget right now and saying, where do I need to spend, knows that with the increase of costs out there, investing in yourself is a really important aspect, and you want to be very confident in the things that you spend money on right now, as they're going to exist and be just as beneficial to you 12 months from now.
Something that, and this is probably the opposite of what Peter or Dustin wants me to say, but something that I would say is, this goes a little bit to the video conversation, where people feel like they know how to make a video, or they know what they're doing, or, they have a sense about how they want to pivot or how they want to handle a rebrand. It doesn't cost any money to have a conversation with somebody like a Dustin or a me, at least an initial conversation. And what I think is really valuable there is to use that as a diagnostic. If you come in and you probably aren't going to work with people like us for whatever reason, you know what I mean? Maybe we gave off a creepy vibe on this call, or maybe you just don't have the money, or maybe you're not sure if you can sell that value up, which I think is the more common thing. I think a lot of times we find folks who aren't sure if they can sell these concepts. Sit down and talk with us, and you'll get a sense of whether you have the in-house expertise, capability, bandwidth, etc., to do some of this stuff on your own, to work yourself through it or not. And I think being able to walk away and going, you know what, I feel like I can handle video production. I'm not scared of that, but I'm sure somebody's going to fleece me if I try to do web. You know what I mean? Like having a sense of that, having a sense of what you can do yourself and what you can't and what you need to learn, etc. I think really helps for you to decide where you want to spend that money. Because if you leave it up to us, we're going to tell you that you should spend the money with us. And if we leave it entirely up to you or your CEO, I don't mean to go after anybody in particular, but if you leave it to the executive suite, you're going to end up with, well, my nephew just finished web design school. They could probably, and that's not the right answer either. It's almost something in between, and I think it's always valuable to just get comfortable with what you know, what you don't know, and then figure out a plan from there. So I would say have conversations, talk to your friendly local agency, and just try to get a sense of what you're maybe prepared to deal with or not. And, and then you can start to figure out costs and actual versus perceived versus where you can cut corners, etc. But those conversations are always good.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with someone from a past webinar, actually. I think at the ending of last year, middle of last year, and we had a lot of conversations past that where they kind of found themselves in the kind of same kind of box where they knew they needed to sort of push an initiative. They didn't know how to approach their C-suite about that kind of initiative, and why spending money on a freelancer in India for a website project is probably not the right answer, and why it took more than 14 months for them to actually produce any results. Sometimes they just need to have a little bit of a support in having a better understanding of like, well, if we went with a local agency, or if we considered this from a different angle, like what would that look like? And having that kind of confidence to have that conversation can sometimes be just, part of what we do too. Because I think at the end of the day, and Nick can kind of, I think as you guys kind of broken into the subject about it, like we like to do good work, but we also, we recognize that every day that these kind of initiatives are to help you and your brands. And like, there have been a lot of projects that we've kind of worked on and jumped on and just been good consulting friends about making sure that you're on the right path. And whether it turns into a project with us, great. If it turns into something that you're able to handle internally, even more so. So that's kind of the trademark, I think, of doing right by everybody, which, helps people not fall into the wrong hole.
I think the last thing I'd say, and this is a little more speculative, but when we're talking about costs, I don't know that next year is going to be any more affordable than this year. In fact, I feel like next year is going to cost a lot more for all of the things that we're talking about here. The reason why I say that is not a lot of people invested in 2023. And that meant that people were kind of forced to reevaluate their staff and forced to reevaluate how they were spending and or how they were billing for a lot of this work. Typically for service-oriented work like this, there's a kind of a trailing indice for inflation. So inflation really peaked last year. A lot of stuff, a lot of things ended up costing a lot more last year than people expected. I suspect that'll start to be the case in production and in creative and marketing pretty soon. You typically see people in this industry are a little hesitant to raise rates. There's a lot of concern about, will I get continued business, particularly in the freelance community. So it's almost always the last time, just at the back end of really big inflation, do you start to see freelance rates go way up. I think you're gonna see that towards the back end of this year and certainly in 2025. Depending on who gets elected, there may very well be 10% increases to all foreign made products, which is the lion's share of tools that are used for web development, multimedia, video design, rebrands, all of those things. A ton of that material comes from Asia. So it's really, I would say there is a window here where things are more affordable in 2024 than I suspect they will be come 2025 and further on. So if this is something that I think broadly, if you're thinking about making these investments from a freelancer level all the way to the large agency space, I think you should talk to somebody. You should take stock of that cost now. See how long a quote is good for. If they give you a quote, try to get that quote good for 90 days, not 30 days. So you've got time to sell it up the chain and get people on board. Because I don't suspect that you're going to see rates for all of this stuff at this level 12, 15 months from now. And I'm kind of looking to Sue, who's been weighing in periodically, for kind of a wink or a nod if that feels the same for you. But that's my feeling, is I think that we're going to see costs kind of go up over time. So
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I agree. I think demand for people in the create, I think demand for the creative industries is going to increase, as you know, as we've seen people. We saw a 14% increase just in budgets over 2023 for our participants. So I think we're going to see more and more demand, which is going to lead to, you know, prices eventually going up. We somehow went through all this in an hour, so that was great. That was a lot to cover. You know, thanks everyone for being on here. We hope to see you on the next one. We have Dustin's contact. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to him. And thanks for everyone for being on, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you next time.
take care.